think that's what they call them.
Well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we are delighted to have Joshua Hood with us today to talk about his brand new book, Burnout. Barbara's holding the advanced reader copy there. And I don't have our signed copies quite yet to hold up, but we will be getting them soon. And I will put a link in the comments field should you wish to purchase one. And joining us is our good friend, Don Bentley, who we really should just like put a cot like in the back room for Don. It's been awesome having you here so many times this year. And of course, you know Don. He's his latest work is the new Vince Flynn Mitch Rapp continuation legacy novel. Kyle Mills is sort of handing the baton over to Don to take over the series, and the new book is going to be called Capture or Kill, and it'll be, what was it, Barbara? September 4th.
September the 4th, and we'll talk a little bit about that after we talk to Josh. But
Right.
It's going to be a kind of a, I can't use the word thriller fest because it's trademarked, but it's going to be kind of a fest in the West where we're going to talk about thrillers. It's going to be fun with Kyle and Brad Taylor and Brian Andrews and Jeff Wilson and Don.
It's going to be awesome.
It is.
Yeah. So if you have questions for Don or Joshua, go ahead and put them in the comments field, and Barbara will bring me back towards the end of the hour, and I'd be happy to ask any questions you might have. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much. Josh, congratulations. Lovely to see
Thank
you.
you.
Excuse me, sorry, with another book. Is your publication date actually tomorrow?
I don't.
I'm not sure.
Sure.
No,
You say it is. I think it's. I'm not really actually sure. I think it comes out in August. Very
you're right.
soon.
It's not till August 13th. Well, here we are, well in advance of Josh's book, which explains why we don't have our signed copies. But I did remind your publisher today that I had sent an order for them, so they'll probably sort it out. Why are we doing this early? Because
You were gracious and you helped me out because you were very busy, I understand.
I was going to say, I think the
And
problem was we ran out of spots in August. It's
yeah,
a ridiculous month. So I want to thank Don, who is just the most brilliant interviewer for, as Patrick mentioned, all the times that he has come this year, both as an interviewer and then once as a fanboy. I loved it. But then I handed him the mobile mic so he could run around Daniel Silva's group and take questions and so forth. And I'm glad that on September 4th, we're going to have Don's own event. But what we're here to talk about is Josh starting. I'm thinking it may be a new series. But before that, Josh, before we get into this, what's going on with Treadstone? Because you too are writing in that whole legacy, or have been anyway, writing in the legacy world.
I think my last understanding was that the Ludlum estate decided to gift the readers with less Treadstone and more Jason Bourne. And so I believe they're putting out 2 Bourne books a year now. And if you've ever read anything Brian Freeman's read, especially what he's done with the Bourne series, it's definitely that. I mean, it's amazing what he's done with that, how he's elevated it. And so that's the last I really heard much of it, anything about it. And I don't think Treadstone will continue. However, now you get more Bourne, so it's kind of a win-win.
Well, thank you for the update. We did talk to Brian very recently.
He's amazing.
I think he's terrific. He's a wonderful writer. I always liked his Jason Stride books, and I have enjoyed the door. But, you just never know. It seems to me that legacy publishing, oftentimes it's sort of stop and go, something happens and then, there's a switch of authors. Well, Don's an example of that. There's a switch of authors, or they decide to go with part of the series. I think Clive was a real pioneer in that. So anyway, so this is let me think, you are introducing an elite smoke jumper. So is that going to be a series you're going to be writing now?
That doesn't really depend on me. I've kind of put my best foot forward, and we'll see what happens next. This was a little bit of I talked myself into this book on accident. We were talking about I thought we were talking about the Guardian book, which was going to be the next one, and they said something that asked, "Was it going to be the next book be a standalone or a continuation?" And so I was like, "Well, I'm not really sure what you're talking about. Or you mean is it going to be a standalone where you don't have to have read the first Guardian to read the second one, or are you talking about a totally other book?" And they're like, "Well, I don't know. What do you have?" And so I told them this idea that I've had for a long time about writing a book about a smoke jumper and it being more of a mystery type thriller than the military. And next thing I know, I'm writing a book about a smoke jumper instead of about the next book in the Guardian series. So hopefully people like it. And if they do, then they'll get to read more. If they don't, then we'll start another series, I guess, or something. Who knows?
Well, it could hardly be more topical. Every day you read the news, California, more of it is burning, and parts of Arizona have been burning fairly steadily here and there. So, I would think that smoke jumpers would be a topic of great interest. Anyway, I'm going to turn this over to Don, who I know has read a copy of the book because we arranged that, and I'll just sit here and listen in.
Well, thank you
Well,
very much.
yeah, thank you for the handoff. And Josh, congratulations. This is number 10. 10 for you. And I've been you and I talk outside of just events with Barbara. And so I've been looking forward to this book for a long time and was very curious about how you were going to write it and what you were going to do. And part of what makes you interesting as a writer is your non-writing career. And so before we get into the book, for folks who don't know you as well as I do, talk us a little bit through your non-writing career and what you did before you decided to grow up and become a writer.
I don't know if I've grown up yet and become a writer, but I don't know, like you, I went to college and then I enlisted in the military. My brother had graduated high school a few months earlier and enlisted um, in the infantry. I also enlisted in the infantry, and it was one of those things where we had grown up. I don't even think I've ever told this story all the way through, but growing up, we kind of came from a pretty poor family, and um, he and I kind of helped raise each other. He's 4 years younger than I am, but we were close and through the thing, we always were able to get each other through things. It's kind of like, and so he was and is and has been my best friend. But when I went down to visit him at basic training, I think it was like right near the end, you're allowed to come down there and visit. Uh, I see this younger, I see a man where there was a boy, 6, 7, I don't know how long it was earlier. And immediately it kind of hits like, there will never be the connection between us again if I don't experience this also. And that was in 2003. So you knew where you were going, you're going to Iraq or Afghanistan, and that kind of solidified it for me. So as soon as before I graduated, I went ahead and enlisted myself because I wasn't smart enough to think the officer program thing all the way through, seat of my pants, and went to the 82nd Airborne, went to Iraq, went to Afghanistan, got out of that. Didn't really have any skills. I majored in English, so what are you going to do with that in college? Then I went on the sheriff's department, and because of my combat experience, was allowed to try out for our full-time SWAT team. Made the team, went all the way up from breacher, equipment guy, breacher, all the way up to the sniper team, and then eventually took over the sniper team as a sniper team leader. Spent about 9 years there, and then left and went and worked for a nonprofit, and then kind of stumbled into writing somewhere along then, and it just became what it is. It's this something that you get paid to do what you love, and it's like, I can't believe this is a job.
So obviously nothing in your background was applicable to the type of books you write. I can't see any corollary in that at all. But all kidding aside, did you have a pretty cool story? Maybe you want to tell it about if I'm remember it correctly, about a buddy who said he was going to write a book, and you're like, by God, he's not going to write one before I do. I'm going to write one first. But did you have in your mind, were you always going to write kind of in the military thriller genre, or did you start somewhere else and gravitate toward that, or how did that work for you?
Well, the story was because I'd gone to college, I came in as an E4, which is a specialist instead of a private. And so my team leader was also an E4, except he'd already gone to Afghanistan and Iraq. So while I had the rank, I was kind of like the lowest thing because I was dumb enough not to have become an officer. And so I'd kind of always wanted to be a writer, but my mom had told me, the only people who make money at writing are people who write ransom notes. And you're going to have to get a real job. And so when I don't know why, but in the military, I told him, his name was Jody. I told him that one day, I want to be a writer. And so they all thought it was hilarious and they made fun of me, hazed me, whatever it was. And so we ended up becoming friends and we talked about books or whatever. He gets out of the military before me. And this was, I don't know, right when I was about to start the sheriff's department. So 2009, and he had right out of high school joined the military. I get a call from him and he said, hey, I just got a degree in creative writing. And I was like, oh yeah, awesome. And I'd not thought about writing books or anything. And he said, and I just finished and published my first book. And I didn't know anything about book publishing. It was like a smaller independent press, but still, it hit me that he had gotten off the couch, and done it. And I'd had this dream and I guess inspired him in some way. And literally after that conversation, I went upstairs and grabbed my old computer that I'd had in Afghanistan and started typing away. Oh, well, it became Clear by Fire. And at the time I was working off we've all heard of that adage, like write what you know, which I think is misunderstood. But I read voraciously growing up, but I was always drawn to, coming from a military family, reading Clancy and Dale Brown, which is one of the bucket list things that I was finally able to check off, was getting a blurb from Dale Brown, which I've been after a blurb from him since my first book. Finally got it with this book. And yeah, so yeah, I forgot where we were going with that. Sorry.
No. So your first book was a military thriller, but you said something interesting there in that the old adage, write what you know. Now, my wife will always say, you can't talk about writing because nobody actually cares about that. And
that's
so
the best part of these conversations.
this
The
will
rest
be
of the time,
my,
like,
I was
Exactly.
read
actually,
my books.
Truly, it's what people tune in for a great deal of the time. And Josh, you've introduced a note that has never yet come up in all these conversations, basically competitive writing. I'm completely fascinated by that as a motivator.
Well, I think there's a lot of voodoo, I would call it, in this writing world and community. A lot of things that are misunderstood, a lot of things that are said, and a lot of some people don't want to admit they write for money. Like, I write for money, but I also write because I love it. But it is a job. And it's not like you have this endless barrel of creativity and stories, and there's forces that act on you, and then you act on the page, and you try to make something that is commercial so you'll make money, because that's kind of the idea of all of this. But there is a huge thing of competition that goes in there. And one thing that I actually didn't start to deal with or begin to understand what PTSD was until I started writing for the Ludlums. And it wasn't just that book. It was, I'd just gotten off of SWAT. I'd basically gone from 2003 till, I don't know, 2009, just running and gunning, no rest. And then all of a sudden I'm married and my first kid shows up. And then I have a serious writing book. It's not just me. It's now like this huge estate, and you're filling
there's a weight there.
Yeah, it was, like I said, I was not getting a lot of sleep because we just had a kid and it was a hard birth, whatever. And it hit this perfect storm. And it was the first time that I realized, like, this is a job that, it takes a lot of work, a lot of work, and that competitiveness and the pressure you put on yourself, it kind of, that competitiveness, what we were talking about, went to a place where I began to equate my self-worth and value with how the book performed. And personally, that was a very dangerous place, and it kind of haunted me for, I had to deal with PTSD therapy or whatever. And people are just like, oh, you're just writing, but you're putting a piece of yourself every time into these books. And when you have to go back, when you're writing military thrillers and you served in the military like you did, Don, and many others have, you're having to go back to this well that it's best left alone. It's best to be dealt with. But if that's like your motivation and your muse is like the worst environment that you ever existed in, you got to keep going back in there. That takes a toll. And so, yeah, the competitiveness comes in because you don't want to say like, I quit, or you don't want to say, well, maybe this next book will be better than this, and I've come to be happy with the journey and the moment instead of what could be or what could happen out of a book. It's like, I think you have to write for the love of it and the fun of it, also that it's a job. And so, yeah, the competitive nature is there. I've learned not to be competitive now. So for my own self-care, I don't read reviews or anything like that.
So you touched on something that was interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way before. And that when I wrote Without Sanction, it was very cathartic for me because there were things in that book that I had not come to terms with because of my service in Afghanistan that I made my character come to terms with, and it actually helped a lot. Now you contrast that when I wrote Forgotten War, which was while Afghanistan was falling, and you and I had text message exchange. I think everybody who served was just staring aghast at seeing 20 years of blood and treasure just go down. And that was a very different experience and a much more taxing one. And so you've written, the Burnout is the first book that really isn't a classic military thriller that you've written. So you've written 9 that kind of fall in that genre. How have you managed to, because you have to, what makes your book so good is the authenticity in there. And so you have to go back to some of those experiences you've lived. And so how have you been able to balance what for me was Without Sanction on one end and Forgotten War on the other? Have you been able to balance that as you write, or is perhaps Burnout, did you choose that subject matter because you didn't want to write military thrillers anymore and have to go through those memories?
For me, that happened during the last or next to last Ludlum book. And for me, I found myself for the first time having like a crisis of conscience, maybe, or maybe that's not even the right word, but I felt that everything that I'd ever known and done and placed value in my time and seen my friends die, like it was all a lie. And so for me, as a patriot, and I think you could be a patriot and say good things or bad things about that war. That's political. This isn't political. This is personal for me. And so, but I had taken great pride in, especially, in every book that I've written, showing the American way of life and the American military, the veterans, warts and all, and showing that maybe we went into Iraq like with this white man's burden of, taking the flaming, torch of democracy and everything into the heart of darkness. Then, maybe we mixed in some Christian things versus Muslims or religion. I mean, you had this really weird thing, but deep in my heart, I've always felt that America, as we were founded on these ideals, the Christian ideals, as a better place, a place where everybody can go, and that we carry these ideals with us, and that we as a culture, for better or worse, reflect that, especially our military and the standards we have and what we do. And like, I've never met a soldier who's like, I want to go to war and just kill a bunch of people. They go there because they have to. It's their duty. And, it's an honor to be able to do that for the country. And for once, though, I grew up hearing these stories from my dad, who was in Vietnam, about how what that felt like coming back when they spit on him, and he had to, they told him before he landed in San Francisco, you need to take off your uniform and put on civilian clothes. And I was like, God, that's terrible. Like, that would never happen again. And true, it didn't happen in that way, but that ideal was lost. And so I was suddenly unable to, maybe unwilling to have a character that was wrapped in the flag because I didn't understand what was going on, and I didn't have a chance, a book to. I
Yeah.
kind of did in the Ludlum book where he's going back to get his friend or whatever, but it takes a while to process that. I mean, that's
Yeah.
your whole life and your whole existence, and so I think that writers seek to convey truth, and one of the difficult things about for me writing an estate book is that you're not able to put as much of your blood, sweat, and self into a book because there are parameters that go with it. And so burnout for me was about using skills that I knew, like action, adventure, and I figured, I was a cop, so I actually be able to write this type of a book, but also, am I able to write this type of a book? I guess
Yeah.
that was. I don't ever want to be like a one-trick pony. I know I rely on what I'm good at, but at the same time, I think you need to test. I personally needed to test myself to see, like, could I do this?
Yeah. Yeah, and so let's talk about burnout, but I want to talk about it in the context of something you said before. So I have told you this before when we've talked, and so I feel pretty confident being able to say this on Barbara's podcast to you. I think you are one of the most underrated writers in this genre. Like, you are a fantastic writer. You're smooth. Your descriptions are amazing. You were published before I was published, and one of the guys I looked up to. And so to see burnout and to see you go to burnout has been really cool for me to watch you pivot to this. But there's something that you said earlier about how writing what you know is a little bit of a false maxim. And so you were certainly a paratrooper. You aren't a smoke jumper. You've never been a firefighter. You don't know this, but you still wrote a great book about a smoke jumper. So pull on that thread a little bit.
I think what we're trying to do is, like, riff on or create this heroic journey. And I think Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero of a Thousand Faces, we've been telling these stories forever. And so the keys are the same in a lot of ways. Like, what makes this person tick? Why would you jump out of an airplane into a fire? And so I think I've done a lot of badass stuff, and people are like, that's awesome, you're tough, whatever they say about that. But on a long enough timeline, you're just going to work, right? That it's like a brain surgeon. Maybe the first couple times when he's just got out of medical school, he's like, I'm going to cut on somebody's brain. But after a while, he just goes to work. He picks up his cleaner, he gets his coffee, and he just goes about it. And I wanted to see how that would happen with a smoke jumper, because I can't imagine anything personally more terrifying on the outset. But at the same time, like, knowing how the military was, I was like, I bet, this is like 50% bullshit. I bet this not as hard. And then you start reading these stories, and I actually met Jason Ramos. He's a smoke jumper. He wrote a book that kind of got me on this path. Read about smoke jumpers, and I was trying to say, like, could I do that? Now I couldn't because my knees and back are shot, but I was confident I could probably do that. And you start talking to these guys, and especially, I think it's like, maybe it's either 12 or 15 minutes, but they have to do this thing called a pack test. So what's interesting about a smoke jumper is that they're part-time. And what's interesting in California is like, that I did not know until I began to write this book. I did not know there was a show kind of about a criminal or a guy, but California has relied a lot on prison labor for firefighting. And so if you're, not in a maximum security thing, you can go to this firefighting school, and as a prisoner, you go out and fight fire with regular people. And then so smoke jumpers are at the high end of this hierarchy. And so they're what's called a tier 1 asset. So what makes them special is, while everybody else works the fire from the back or the sides in, they jump ahead of the fire and move backwards. And so it's dangerous. But I was looking at the time hacks, and I was like, I could probably, with the 80-pound pack, make a 2-miler in 15 minutes or whatever the time is. And I was talking to Jason about it. He's like, yeah, but you can't run. I was like, well, what do you mean you can't run? Like an Army standard is like 15-minute mile underweight, 40 pounds. I was like, what do you mean you can't run? How do you walk that fast? And it says, well, one foot always has to be on the ground. So you kind of do this really weird shuffling that I was like, well, hold on. So what else do you guys do? And so then he begins to explain like what it means, how you have to know what a fire does, how you have to know like what the different type of smoke means, the way, and um so in learning that, the next thing became is like, how do you incorporate that? And so I tried to use the descriptive, the senses that I've used in the military thrillers, uh to create that pacing of, instead of gunshots, it's the fire as the enemy and stuff. And we'll see how successful I was, but
So I think your descriptions are you're an incredibly smooth writer, but I think your descriptions are some of my favorite parts. And so I'm going to read a sentence and then ask you to talk about it a little bit. So we haven't talked about Shade yet, but Slade, excuse me. Slade is the protagonist who's a brand new smoke jumper who has a bit of a chip on his shoulder because he was a convict, kind of like as you were laying out before, and is trying to prove himself as a smoke jumper. And so it says Slade reached the apex in time to see a Forest Service Sherpa come in low over the trees, the blink of its nav light shimmering through the smoke coiling up from the spot fires, surrounding the still smoldering cabin. So it's beautiful imagery, but it also puts you right in the scene and has conflict in there and all kinds of good stuff. And so did you when you write that way, is it something that you're choosing to do to try and be a little bit different? Because this genre doesn't often have descriptions like that. It can be very action oriented, very dialogue oriented, to the detriment of really pretty language and descriptions like that. Is that something that comes natural to you? Is it something that you try and do to incorporate into this genre, or how do you do that?
I mean, first off, that's like extremely high praise coming from you. I've always your prose, Nick Petrie. Um, there's a few others that are true. Like I call you, and I've told you this, are a true wordsmith. And you read it, and you're like, God, like I suck at life, And so, um, for me, um, I've always tried to look at a book like you're watching a movie. I try to put myself there, and what would I notice? And the besides the fire and the characters, this Six Rivers Forest was a character unto itself. It had a
Mhm.
personality. It had a backdrop, and I've always tried to do that in a book. Pick a place that can serve as a character of its own in a way. And for me, I just felt that as a paratrooper or whatever, like that's your lifeline, and you're always like, what is it about helicopters and airplanes that draw men's attention there? And, it was kind of, I thought like the scene before he'd had this kind of altercation and he's going through some stuff. And I just see, like if I read a book, that's what I want to see. I don't want to just
Mhm.
see the character. I don't want to just like this. I want to see the vista, if that makes sense. And for me, it was just an opportunity to kind of like, hey, we've been real close to the character. We've been internal. We know the struggle. Let's just pan out and take a look at this natural beauty that's surrounding us. And I don't know. I wish I could say that like I thought about it and executed it well. It just felt kind of right then.
I think in a really well-written book, even a fiction book, that readers resonate with the veracity on the page. And so whether that's the emotions, whether it's the conflict. And so there were portions in here, like I kept trying to reconcile you writing this book with the book, because like the way that you describe fire, the way that you talk about how it moves and I'm like, man, I don't think he was ever a firefighter, but now I kind of think he was. And part of that is credit to you as a writer, but what you talked a little bit about interviewing the smoke jumper. Like, did you go out with the guys at all? Did you do any, or what was kind of some of the other research that you did to prepare yourself to write this?
To be honest, like the biggest thing that stuck with me for whatever reason was that movie Backdraft.
Mm,
And, I like the personification of, elemental things. And we, like water, it has a movement and a power of its own, and fire the same. And if you remember that movie, I think it's Robert De Niro plays, I think he's an investigator, his name's Shadow, and he's talking about he's I can't remember Baldwin, one of the younger
one of them.
Baldwins.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's like his student or whatever. And so
Yep.
he takes this spray bottle of some type of accelerant and he sprays it up and he catches on fire and he's showing him what the fire does and how the fire's
Mm,
alive. And when you think about it, like fire is one of those things that it eats, it breathes, it hates, it talks. And I guess I think that when you write about anything, it's like I was never in the CIA, but I wrote about that. What
sure.
you need a level of authenticity. I think that's where a lot of books fail. When you see some new authors, they'll tell you this, that here we go, show versus tell. I don't mean to get into that, but what does that really mean? It means like
Hmm.
I don't want to know that there's a water cooler in the break room next to the CIA office. I want to know what like sound it makes. I want to know if the plastic is cracked. I want to know if I want to know those things about
That's good.
the, you know, the break room that only the people that have been there, like what does it sound like when you open the refrigerator? And I think it's those details that are kind of like when you go to not to say I'm at this level, but I think that we all strive this level. When you go to like the Louvre, you go anywhere, you look at a
Hmm.
painting, you look at it from like what's his name? Dude, Van Gogh was really good at this. You look at my dad was a painter and an artist, so this is why I was brought up. But you look at a painting from a distance, you see it for a painting. But then when you get close, especially with Van Gogh, you see the ridges of the paint because he loved to put so much paint on there. And you see the individual brushstrokes and you see that those brushstrokes are making something even more delicate, and as you kind of get in those layers. And I think that a lot of times, for me at least, when I'm trying to write anything, but especially this book, like I don't want somebody to call bullshit on me. I don't
Yeah.
want somebody to be like, yeah, you almost got it or whatever. And so I spend sometimes to my detriment a long time researching because I know when you have enough. And I know when
Hmm.
I got enough ammo to go out and like do whatever, but that surface layer and even the layer below it's usually not where it's at. It's where only an insider perhaps would know. And that's what I try to push for.
So another speaking of insider, and this is where I think your background as a cop definitely came in, is what makes this book unique is the fire is not the antagonist per se. There's a murder mystery going on. There's a potential corruption in the DEA. There's a DEA officer who is trying to choose between duty and family and regain. And so the DEA character, where did he come from and why did you decide to add him to the book? Because you could have written it just as a murder mystery, or you could have written it just as a book about a smoke jumper trying to prove himself. What made you decide to add that layer of the DEA officer and the conflict going on there?
Well, for me, a lot of things that happen in books or reactions are basically they're accidents or mistakes that I've made. And so I wrote this book thinking that there would be I knew I needed like somebody behind the scenes. I needed some type of corruption to fuel what was going on. And I assumed that the Forest Service would have something.
Hmm.
And a month into this, when I should have been writing, I'd exhausted every Google search possible about the Forest Service, and all I came up with was um, some guy out west, like sending the Forest Service trucks to his brother-in-law to get clean cheaper and save 10 cents. And he got in trouble for corruption on that. Like it was so clean. Like I literally, and this is probably naivete on my part, but I assumed it'd be like the CIA or any large government agency. I was like, there's got to be graft and corruption and criminals there. It's like these are like the Smokey the Bear people. There's not. They love nature. They eat granola. They pick up litter. The hardest, the meanest thing they do is give somebody a ticket. And so I was like, well, crap, this isn't going to work. This whole book's going to fall apart. I need something here. And so I like books and ideas where it's kind of you get a call from a dead man or something like that. And so I knew, what do you do? And so I was able to called up some dudes that I knew, narcotic detectives, and I was like, just tell me your most messed up stories. So they started telling me these stories that have nothing to do with anything. And then somewhere along the lines, they start talking about CIs and the crazy stuff CIs do, and how, sometimes, if you're on working narcotics, there is no black or white, there's gray. And I was like, I know all about the gray area. And so like, that's where it came in. And I ended up kind of playing with this, and then just found I kind of started looking at that character almost like a Columbo guy, and what does it all mean now? And I think that went a little bit back to what we talked about earlier in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And I like anymore. So I can't write about 23 and 30-year-old people. So now I have to look at my life and think of like, where am I? I used to picture myself when I was younger in these books, running around. And now when I picture myself, I'm the broke, the old broke guy with the gray hair and, that's at the tail end of the career in this. And it was just one of those things that, I don't know, it just felt, he felt like where I should be writing a book. So it kind of went in there, happenstance, maybe. I don't know.
No, that's awesome.
Don,
Yes, ma'am.
Can I interrupt for a moment? I was fascinated with two things. One, how much money is there washing around among these guys? And do you know the average, according to Google, the average salary of a hotshot fighter, which we'll get to in a minute, is just under $49,000 a year, or basically $23.52 an hour. So people are not going into this for big money, nor is there big money washing around in terms of salary. So I see Josh's point about needing to look, somewhere else. But the other thing I did, we had a tragedy here where a group of hotshots in Scottsdale all died. And so I was looking up to see, what is the difference, Josh, between a smoke jumper and a hotshot guy?
So my understanding of doing the research on all of that is that a hotshot, so you start off on what's called a hand crew. And I think it was either the Jack Carr podcast or this one, but I talked about burnout, and I was planning to write burnout the last time. And I got a call or an email first from an actual guy that was on a hand crew. And so a hand crew is basically where you start off. So you have two types of basic fires. You have structure fire, and you have wildland fire. So structure fire is like what typically all the firemen do and stuff like that. And then you have wildland fire, which is a totally different skill set. But you start off on what's called a hand crew, and they're the guys that they go out there and they're just cutting, all the what they call duff. They do this thing called cutting line. So the idea is like you just go through and you cut the ground down to the mineral earth, and you're making like a barrier for it to burn across. And so once you get your, I think they call it a red card, and that says you're like a level 1 fireman. And then you have to get a lot of schools and classes to move up. And the next level is either helitac, where you use a helicopter, or a hotshot crew. And a hotshot crew, I think, is a level 2 fighter. And so they can respond on their teams, once they qualify, gets put into a national database. And so when there's a fire, and if there's anybody out there listening and I'm messing this up, I apologize. It's been a while since I did my research, but there's basically a fire center. When the fire season starts breaking up, starting off, they have this huge bullpen of, we have this team here, this team there. There's teams in Alaska, there's teams in, most of them are out west, but There's a team in Alaska that I read about, and each one has to deal with a different type of fire. But to be a hot shot, you have to be a level 2 crew, and that means that wherever there's a fire, they can pull your crew and send it there. And so uh, these guys spend the entire summer just bouncing from fire to fire. And so um, the next level up are the smoke jumpers, and the smoke jumpers are so specialized. They jump in at the head of the fire, they get it contained, or they jump way into the back country or up in the mountains and deal with these small fires before they become a big fire. And then once they're done, they get pulled out and they get dropped somewhere else. And then the hot shots move up beside them, and those guys are like the grunts. They're the guys that they're going through with these chainsaws, and they're just felling everything to try to get this fire under control. And yeah, I hope that was a very long answer, but it takes a lot. The way I say it is, it doesn't sound like a lot, but these guys, the amount of knowledge they have just on wind factors. I downloaded their manuals, because you have BLM land, and you have Forest Service land. And I'm downloading these manuals. And what was interesting is, like, I learned one of the very first smoke jumper crews was an airborne crew called the Triple Nickel, and there was an all black airborne unit that, because they were black, they weren't allowed to go serve in World War II. So they sent them out west to help the smoke jumpers. And you just read this history about how these guys were like the first person to do it. I think it was called, I don't want to get it wrong, but it might have been the Man Gulch fire. And basically all these hot shots, or their version, got burned up because the fire moved so quickly. So they said, we need to be able to get people into the fire faster. How do we do that? And this guy's like, you could throw them out of an airplane. It's like, well, let's go see if that works. And it was almost like the last of the pioneers in a way.
Mm-hmm. Well, with the climate change and the, terrible heat, and also the really dangerous conditions this year where there was so much rain that a lot of stuff grew up, and now it's so hot it's all dried out. So there's so much more fuel on the ground.
And the bad part is that, well, the tragic part is the hot shots and line crews that come out of the California prison, they make $2 a day.
Yeah, but they're out of prison. I mean, that's part of the attraction. There was somebody else who wrote a book somewhat like this, and that was a huge part of the attraction, was that they got out. They were out there, in the forest, regardless of how dangerous it was. And after all, being in prison for a lot of guys is really dangerous too. So
well, luckily, a lot of the guys that did that, it was part of their rehabilitation. And recently, I think they've signed into law. For a while, they weren't allowed to go become firemen afterwards, or EMTs, even though they learned these skills. But they've recently changed the law, which is good, that they could take these skills and use them if they want to continue being a wildland firefighter after. Because I didn't realize the scope of these fires and how it just, like, you see them on the news. And I live out in the South where it rains all the time.
Tragically, I'm afraid it's a growth profession. So
yeah, it is.
Given everything that's going around. Don, I'm sorry, I cut you off. What was it you would like to finish up?
No. That might be the best way to finish up, because I was going to ask him the same question about the difference between the smoke jumper and the hot shot. And so we can kick it to Patrick and
All
take
right.
questions, unless you have something else, Barbara.
No. But I mean, we're all much more conscious of the danger of fire. When I grew up, everybody where I lived in Chicago, the thing you worried about was your house catching fire, lightning strike or whatever. But I mean, I thought it was interesting that there's a town burning in California at the moment, or under threat. And yet, people knowing how dangerous it is have built homes in isolated places where there are targets. And I think about that. It's kind of like people on the Gulf Coast who keep rebuilding in the face of hurricanes, or people in Houston who, knowing that it's flooding and it's going to get worse because they basically concreted over all the drainage. And, why is it that people are buying real estate on cliff tops above the ocean right now? Or big estates in Florida? Why would you be paying millions of dollars for waterfront property in Florida? right now. I think what's interesting to me is that how people can kind of blind themselves to reality, or it can't happen to me, or whatever it is, choosing. I remember years ago, somebody I knew chose to build a house on the San Andreas Fault. I mean, I was, went to Stanford. We were all like earthquake trained, the whole bit. And here comes this person who actually builds a house deliberately on the fault. And I find that such an interesting quirk. Or maybe not a quirk, maybe it's a pathology. I don't
Or
know.
maybe it's just hubris of like being human. I
Maybe.
think we think that we can um, change the earth in our image, and that's not the way it works. The spirituality of God creating all this, and the creation, groaning. And then I even try to address it a little in the book. Is like, why are these forest fires worse? And it's like, well, you start to look at water, and I didn't even know before I went into this the whole thing about like these illegal grow sites that are happening out,
Yep.
and people say, well, it's the cartel, they're doing this and that, and it's like, well, at the same time, we're buying all the drugs that these guys are planning, and it's okay. They said that last year, I think they stole like 600 million gallons of water just to feed these marijuana plants. And I never knew anything about this. And that's the other thing that's kind of interesting about this book is Phil, it's pretty awesome to write a book where you learn something and maybe get to teach somebody else some stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely true. Well, I agree with whoever said that the next really big war, aside from the really big wars going on at the moment, which are horrible, but possibly the next world encompassing war is all going to be about water because there's just not enough of it.
Yeah, it's like that book Cadillac Desert.
Yeah, right. But I mean, we see it here. And indeed, firefighting may have to try to find another resource to combat fire other than water. I mean, if there isn't any water, what is
And it
it?
better be environment friendly, right? That's the
Well,
that's the other
I
part.
mean,
It's
I think it's a really interesting thought. What if the traditional fire suppression tool, water, is not available to you? Then what do you do? And is what you do then going to be more damaging in the
Yeah.
long run? I mean, everything has consequences, it's that whole butterfly wing thing. But
Yeah.
I'm not, I think we are facing a lot of unexpected or unforeseen consequences. We tinker along without really realizing, the potential that we create for different disaster.
Yeah.
Here we are, right? All right,
Yeah.
Patrick, on that cheerful note, do come and see if we have any
that
questions.
face says it all. Patrick's like, wow, that got dark.
Yeah. Well, Ryan Steck is watching, and he
always
says,
good.
We
says
sold your
that's it.
last book today, Ryan, the last signed copy. Thank you for
I
signing
talked to
it.
him this morning.
He says we need Josh to paint the cover for his next book.
Yeah, that wouldn't turn out well.
What kind of work do you do? Artwork do you do, Josh?
I don't do any, but my dad was a artist. He's a painter, and he was a graphic artist and a painter. So he, I grew up around all the artist friends and watching him work. And now I got my son and my little daughter. She's in the art space, so the whole house looks like a art project all the time.
Let's see. Okay, some of the questions you've answered, like, did you speak to any smoke jumpers? Yes.
Yeah, I thought the special forces guys, and that's one thing about being in the military, as Don can probably say, you kind of have this card where it's like, oh, I'll talk to you. I didn't know that the world of the fire, wildfire, they have that same thing. And like nobody wanted to tell me anything. Nobody wanted to talk to me. No active firemen. I tried to go out there and I reached out and said I'd jump with them or whatever. And it was just like, that is a closed society where it reminded me a lot of the military where you have this closed group and you're an outsider, you're not getting in. And so with that, I tried to make sure that it didn't disrespect or do anything, because you don't know when you're walking into this territory where no one tells you the left and right limits. You have to be, at least I do, I always want to be very careful and cognizant of not painting them in a bad light while telling a story.
Sure. Okay, let's see. Somebody asked, are there any women in this book?
No, there aren't any women. And the reason there aren't any women is because of the last book I wrote, where there's a new kind of, I don't know if this is universal, but in my experience, or a year or two ago, it got very difficult and testy when you wrote about women in any way, where people were thinking, well, is this sexist? Or you trying to demean them? And I'm like, I'm just going to write a book with no women in it.
You have a woman in there, you just kill her. She's the murder victim, so she
That's
doesn't
right.
hang out very long.
Dang it. But I didn't objectify her. I didn't objectify her.
She died a non-objectified death. You did well.
Yeah.
One way to avoid Me Too. Just
Exactly.
a sex
I think it
book.
was Nelson DeMille, like on your show. I was listening to that, and he was talking about his last book, and I was just like, man, things really have gotten crazy. That was writing about women was the first time I'd ever come in contact with any form of censorship, and I just thought it was kind of odd, because who doesn't like women? I don't know. It was just something new.
It is a strange climate we find ourselves in. Let's see here. Okay, yeah, Robin, this is going back to Don. Don, was it easier to have your character process their wartime experience versus addressing it as yourself?
That's a hard question to answer, because we talked about Nick Petrie a little bit before, and he's a fantastic writer. He's kind of one of my mentors, and he told me once that, and I'm sure he didn't come up with this himself, because there's a variation, but I heard it from him the first time, that if you want the reader to feel pain, then you as the writer have to feel pain as you're writing the book. And so I think if you're going to make your character process something, you have to feel that, regardless of what it is, whether it's military or non-military. And so for me, I think when I wrote Without Sanction, I'd had time to process. Like, I got out of the Afghanistan, for me, was 2005 to 2006. Without Sanction, I think came out in 2020, but I think it sold maybe in 2018 or 19 or something. So whatever that is, almost 12 years or something, I'd had time to process it and kind of work through. When I was writing Without Sanction in the middle of the fall in Afghanistan, that just wrecked me. And I think probably every veteran writer has the same story. And I was texting with a lot of them. I was texting with Josh at that time. There was about 2 weeks where I couldn't work at all, and I was just consumed by anger, and it would alternate between anger and kind of what Josh said is like, does nothing matter? Does none of the sacrifices, and it felt like Afghanistan was this house of cards, and if you pulled one out, then did that mean Iraq didn't matter? Did that mean that the people that we'd lost there didn't matter? And so it was much more difficult to write that book, because I was trying to figure it out in real time as I was writing it.
I think the genre for me personally, became very difficult to exist in for a while. And I don't know if I've gotten out of that. We touched on it earlier, but I guess, yeah, maybe it's a personal thing, but it's one of those things where you're trying to reflect the best of your country, but your country's not reflecting it back to you. And that I've ever since then, I've had, it's like it's been this kind of, you look at things through a magnifying glass where you used to not. And for me, it's been difficult. And I was kind of curious too. I don't know what's going to happen with your series, but do you feel that like pull? Like, cause I had, my first two books, they just stopped, and I didn't get to write the third one, never got to finish it. Do you feel that kind of tug of unfinished business, or are you able to say just to move on because you've got other things to do, and you think you could express those same things? Because your first book is kind of like your first love. You're never gonna.
Yeah.
It's like being forced to divorce your wife. That's the only way I've ever been able to explain it. And I was just curious what you thought of that.
Yeah, so I don't intend to stop writing mine. What after I wrote Forgotten War, my editor at the time, Tom Colgan, who's you've got to work with too, is a fantastic
Yeah,
editor.
yeah.
He said, "Hey man, I want you to take a break and write a standalone next." And we kind of talked a little bit about what that might be, and then I had my own ideas, and then the Mitch Rapp thing, Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp thing happened, and so I've been working on that standalone in between gaps of when I'm sending a book off to edit or I have a little time to do it, and still think that'll be my next book. But I still have ideas for those stories, and I think it sounds weird a little bit unless you're a writer, but those characters talk to you and they talk to you in different voices, and so I still hear stuff. I think that's a Matt story, or that's, a Matt Drake that's talking right there. And so I still intend to go back to my series. I think you do, like you said, it has to be, I think in this genre, it has to be not. Brad Taylor has this good thing, a good way of saying it that I'm going to mangle, but as a writer who writes espionage thrillers, political thrillers, military thrillers in that thing, you don't want to try and beat current events, but you want to reflect them and think. And so as the world changes, your writing has to change in the way. I mean, Barbara was alluding to before, I got to go out and meet Daniel Silva, who's a hero of mine. He's my favorite living writer. And he's even, I think it was his 24th Gabriel Allon book. And this book was much, much different than, his first book or really, this, I think, was the first book where there was no mention of the Mossad and no spy stuff. And he's writing, I think some of that is a reflection of the world around him. And then some of it is where he is as a writer. And so I still intend to go back to my series after I finish this standalone, but it's also, they'll be different because I've changed and the world changed in the meantime too.
Let me say something, guys. I mean, I've lived a lot longer than both of you. In my lifetime, we've sent men to Korea, and then there was a presidential dispute, Truman versus MacArthur. Guys had to come home. Vietnam was really my war. What was the point of Vietnam ever? Very divisive. Guys had to come home. What was it for? Then we've had, Iraq, we've had all of these wars have not been on American soil. These have all been wars fought in other countries. And frankly, except for maybe Korea, to my mind, nobody ever really asked what was the point. Why were we in Afghanistan? What were we going to do with Afghanistan? What were we going to do with Vietnam? Had we succeeded in beating, I think there's been some very ill-advised foreign wars, and it's not your fault, none of you, that the conception of the war is what failed, not you, not the sacrifices you guys made. What was wrong was, why were we there in the first place? What if, supposing that somehow or other we'd managed to subdue the Afghan, what would come next? And how long would it last?
That's a great point. I just personally, for me, like, I don't think the world can ever question why we were in Afghanistan. Like, we were attacked, and I don't take any, blame or guilt from that. I personally just felt that the American soldier deserved a little better. And I know what you've gone through, especially with your loss in Vietnam, and because your husband was Special Forces in Vietnam, wasn't he?
He was a Green Beret.
And so I don't mean, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, but that's a sacred, sacrifice that you gave this country and that he gave. And I guess I feel at some level that it's not about me at all. It's about those who didn't come back. And, maybe if we'd just waited, a few more months. War is never the best option, but it is an option. It is a fact. I'm not going to turn into a hippie. But at the same time, those questions come like, why so quickly? Why so abruptly? We knew we couldn't be there forever. We're get off track, but yes, you exactly.
I'm certainly not saying that I thought the withdrawal was well handled. I'm just saying that in the long term, I don't know that it was ever going to be a war that
Oh, absolutely.
was worth the price, or if we had been more successful, what we've done with it. The British empires before us had all failed.
And I got to talk to Ralph Peters, one of guy I really look up to. He wrote Red Army actually the other day, and he said something that kind of opened my eyes. This little ray of sunshine. He said that America is very good at tactics, but not very good at strategy, and that's not new. And kind of what you said, every generation has to come to grips with that.
Yeah, I think really, if you look back, the American Revolution, we won it on strategy. I mean, it really was. If you think about it, the British were completely unprepared to fight in their, European style. It didn't work in America. But since then, I mean, the Civil War, which was, I think, the most heartbreaking of all the wars. I mean, just, what was the strategy on both sides, or was it just that the side wasn't just that, but was it always going to be the case that the side with the most manpower, the most munition, most armament, the whole bit, was always going to win? It was eventually going to wear down the other side, which is a question we're looking at with Russia and Afghanistan.
I think
the South was always going to lose that war.
I think what makes Afghanistan different and Iraq too is the fact that they were all volunteer armies. And the reason why that's important is because, it's something like less than 1/4% of the American public served in Iraq or Afghanistan over that 20 years. And so those men and women who volunteered did exceptionally well. But I think because the majority of Americans had no skin in the game, they didn't have any brothers or sisters or sons or daughters serving, that for 20 years, we as a nation allowed our leaders to just drift along without a strategy, and thank God there weren't Americans coming home in body bags every day like the Vietnam War. But because of that, there wasn't, I think, as much of a forcing function to keep those in charge, that sacred trust that the sons and daughters, because I'm a parent now and my son's going to be commissioned in a month. And I told him, I was like, you don't get it when you're a young leader, how much, what it means for a father or a mother to give to you their most prized possession in the world in the form of their son and daughter, and you bear the responsibility of leading them in combat. You don't understand that when you're 20 years old, and you really don't understand it till you're 50 years old and you have your own son and daughter who is potentially in that spot, and you're entrusting them to someone you don't know that's going to lead them in combat potentially. And I think because of that, because, not on any malfeasance on their part, but just because it was easy for the American population to forget about Afghanistan, because the majority of them did not have anybody serving in that war. And for that reason, it was allowed to just drift along for 20 years.
I think that's a very, very well said. Very good point, huh?
So there wasn't as much public scrutiny, demanding answers, and also maybe demanding specifics. Hey, what is really going on?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me, and then we'll stop this discussion, but as an historian, we didn't want to fight in World War One. It was very, very difficult, and we got there towards the end. In World War II, everybody forgets this now. We didn't actually declare war on Germany. The only reason that we ended up fighting on both sides was that Germany declared war on us. So we had the same reluctance, to engage. I mean, the Japanese attacked us. So, as you say, skin in the game. So contrast that with Vietnam, with Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think you're absolutely right that their accountability was lacking. There have been some terrible strategy. Look at the Crimean War. The British made a total hash out of that. If you look at World War II and the Dardanelles, Churchill's to blame for it, but his idea was great. His strategy was terrific. The execution is
Yeah.
and he was the GOAT, so to speak, which, I think probably made him the leader that he was in the Second World War.
Yeah.
So war's a terrible thing.
Yeah.
You're so right about skin in the game and all the rest of it. Anyway, we're back to firefighters. We got distracted. Sorry about that. But I do think that Josh is writing a book that is very much of the moment and very much going to be of the moment for reasons that we've already talked about, that with water resources going smaller and climate change and people living in places that are not easily defended from fire and so forth, we're going to see a lot more in terms of these people who are, again, like hotshots, bravely, willing to risk their lives to, the enemy's fire, not the Russians, whatever. So I certainly think it's an important book in that respect, Josh, and I hope that you will be able to write a continuation. But as you point out, publishing is a business, and it's not always up to the author.
Can I ask one more quick question for both of you guys? Does writing a historical novel appeal to either one of you? Maybe you're writing a novel, a World War II era novel, or does that hold any appeal?
For me, I've always been afraid to write a book. Well, and it's been so long since I've written a book and haven't had a contract before I start writing it, and haven't had, we want this book because we like this idea and we're going to pay you for that. And luckily, I guess I'm in a position where I don't have a contract for another book. So for the first time in like 10 years, I'm free to write whatever I want. And that's something new. And it was terrifying for a little bit, but now, due to other things that have worked out, I'm able to, yes, I have thought about that. And I think that's the only reason, when you're writing contract to contract, it's kind of like, you're not really the boss anymore. And for the first time, it's just like, I can write whatever I want. And yes, I would love to write historical books about World War II, Vietnam, anything, because it's all very fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because one of my favorite writers now, Tom Colgan, actually introduced me to him, as a guy who, his name is P.T. Duderman. And so he writes these series of books that take place in World War II that are just fantastic. He was a naval officer. Almost all his books take place during the Pacific Campaign, right as the kamikazes is reaching their apex. And he's written a bunch of them from different vantage points, from everything from a new fighter pilot to, one of them I think is called the Commodore, to, a flight surgeon and everything in between. And so I never thought I would want to write a straight up historical, but in Forgotten War, it was the first book I'd written where it was tied to current events. And so there were some binders there, or barriers rather, that I had to work around. And then in Capture or Kill, because it takes place during the Bin Laden raid, it was kind of the same feel. Like I said, not a historical, but I knew there were certain things I couldn't mess up. And I knew that I had to work within the boundaries of it. And so it's interesting. I might have some ideas. No, I might have some ideas going forward that are a little historical in nature, but you'll have to stay tuned.
Wow. Well, all I can say is I'm glad your kids are moving out of the house and you'll have even more time to write. And Josh, you know what? There are many, many avenues to publishing today. And as long as you have an audience, you have a lot more options about what you want to write and how you want to publish. What it just would be, the killer would be to start at ground zero, with your first novel. But, that's not your case. So it's maybe a great chance for you to explore things that, every year. Do you know that this week, I keep saying this because I feel so totally defeated. I got my email today from Edelweiss. This week alone, 3,000 new books have published. 3,000.
That's crazy.
They are not all coming from one publisher. They are not all coming from Blackstone or Penguin Random House or Hachette or Simon & Schuster or whatever. So there's just this huge array. And the secret, guys, is to find a channel to readers. And you've already done that, Josh. You know, you already have readers and you've got authors. So you have a lot more opportunities now than you would have had 10 years ago, or if you were writing your first novel.
Well, the cool thing was at SHOT Show when I was signing The Guardian, I met a guy, and I don't know how this happened other than God, but was signing these books, and he asked, "Are you going to write another book?" And I said, "Oh, I'm not sure. I'd really like to write video games." And it turns out this guy worked for this huge video game company, Bohemia. And over the next few months, we talked, and now I'm over there writing for them on this new game that's coming out called Arma 4. And
That's awesome.
yeah, just taking writing doesn't have to be limited to just books, and the
It certainly
stories can
does
be told
not. My
everywhere.
son-in-law is on the cybersecurity team for what's it called? Line of Duty? Is that the big one?
Oh, Call of Duty.
Call
Yeah.
of Duty, yeah. It's unbelievable how much money's involved in it and how engaged people are in it. You know what? If you wrote a really hit video game, it would reflect in book sales. It's
Yeah.
like getting a movie, you know.
Yeah.
Get a movie, then your book sales, you know, expand because you find you have a channel to an audience. I mean, Patrick and I have seen that over the years, right, Patrick?
Oh yeah.
The
for sure.
effect of a film is remarkable. So anyway, thank you. Patrick, was there any final thing that you
No,
all
I don't
right.
think so.
Well then, thank you very much, guys. Don, I will look forward to your brief.
Yeah, I can't wait.
Yeah, write it as though, you know, you were talking to
that.
somebody over the counter selling your book, will you?
Hypothetically speaking.
Hypothetically speaking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for
Books
having
will
me.
be coming your way to sign for those of you who would like to order a copy of Burnout, although it's going to be a little bit because we are so in advance of the publication date. So patience is the key here.